In a previous video, we talked about how with fixed exchange rates or pegged exchange rates, that a country may end up running an overall balance of payments surplus or deficit, depending on whether or not the exchange rate that is pegged or fixed is or is not at the equilibrium exchange rate as far as the private market is concerned. So generally speaking, unless you're really lucky, you're not going to have the exchange rate, the official exchange rate, just exactly where you don't run a balance of payments surplus or a deficit. Now, you recall from the earlier video, if you have a balance of payments deficit, you should have three things very much associated in your mind. That if with a balance of payments deficit, there's an excess supply of domestic currency, and I should write in the foreign exchange market. So in the foreign exchange market, there's an excess supply of domestic currency at that exchange rate, at the pegged exchange rate. That results in a pressure for depreciation. And what the central bank does to prevent that depreciation from occurring is to buy up the domestic currency in exchange for official reserves, hard currency that they have on hand in the bank. So you lose official reserves as you maintain the overvalued exchange rate. So all of those things should be associated with each other in your mind. Balance of payment surplus, just the opposite. In this case, it's an undervalued currency. And with that undervaluation comes with an excess demand for domestic currency. In order to keep the exchange rate from rising in value, because there's pressure for appreciation, the way you prevent that from occurring is by taking in domestic currency, giving out domestic currency and taking official reserves in. So balance of payment surplus is associated with gaining official reserves. Now, the question really comes up, what's the problem? What's the problem with either one of these? Especially if you have a sustained balance of payment surplus or deficit over time. Now, I want to remind you that when we talk about a balance of payment surplus, we're not talking about a trade or balance payment surplus or deficit. We're not talking about a trade surplus or deficit. It's this broader measure of sales of goods, services, and assets. Okay, so what's the problem with say having So let's think first about the disadvantages of, say, a balance of payments deficit. Now this one is actually fairly straightforward. If you have a balance of payments deficit, you're losing official reserves. You are dipping into this stock of hard currency and gold that the central bank has in order to maintain the exchange rate. There is a finite supply of other countries' money that can be in a central bank. So, for example, if Argentina, in a very prominent example in the late 1990s and early 2000s, had a balance of payments deficit, the currency was pegged to the dollar 1-to-1, was overvalued. There was pressure for a depreciation. They started losing official reserves. So they couldn't get the dollars needed to keep the exchange rate fixed. So what finally happened, well, let me just say this generally, you can run out of official reserves. Running into a balance of what's often called a balance of payments crisis, where you are running out of your ability to peg, and then you stop pegging, you stop intervening, and you have a massive devaluation of the currency. Now, we'll talk more about this later, but if you go from, say, $1 per peso to, say, $1 per 10 pesos, that's enormously disruptive. Anybody that's trying to buy imported goods suddenly can't get enough pesos to, can't get enough dollars to pay for it. So the balance of payments deficit can run into problems if you run out of official reserves, and you'll have these sharp, dramatic changes in the exchange rate. Again, we'll talk about this later. Oftentimes when the IMF gets involved in a country, it's when they have chronic, sustained balance of payments deficits, and they're running out of official reserves. So that just happens again and again and again, whether it be Greece or Argentina or many, many countries that have an IMF program. It's really to deal with chronic balance of payments deficits, running out of official reserves. Now the downside, so again, keep all of these things in mind. Now the disadvantages of a balance of payments surplus is much less obvious. But real. Again, with this undervalued currency, you're running a balance of payments surplus. You have pressure for appreciation. You prevent the appreciation from occurring by shoving domestic currency out into the foreign exchange market and pulling in, you put your domestic currency out into the foreign exchange market and gain official reserves. Okay, so you're piling up official reserves: gold, dollars, yen, euros if you're a developing country. Okay, so what's the problem? Okay, you've got lots and lots of official reserves. You could just do that forever. Well, here's the thing. With a balance of payment surplus, the intervention of gaining official reserves means that you push domestic currency into circulation. Okay, you're taking in official reserves and pushing money out. And what that can cause is pressures for domestic inflation. Okay, the more and more domestic currency that's floating around in the domestic economy, the more pressures there are for domestic inflation. Now, let's be very clear, that's a problem. That's not likely to be a crisis. Okay, so a balance of payments surplus can be a problem if it's sustained and inflation becomes an issue. But you're not likely to have a balance of payments surplus running into what we would call a balance of payments crisis. That's really with the balance of payments deficit, sustained over time. So both of these have disadvantages. They both have advantages to having these two types of circumstances associated with the fixed exchange rates. But bottom line is that when you have fixed exchange rates or pegged exchange rates, you're likely going to run a balance of payments deficit or surplus unless the government pegs just exactly the right amount. An unchanging exchange rate over many, many years will probably result in either a surplus or a deficit going on and on, which is why countries sometimes change the value of the currency over time. But balance payments deficit, you should associate with that possibility of long-term balance payments crisis because of the loss of official reserves. That's really where this comes up more often than elsewhere.